Hello, from Tokyo, from self-isolation. My name is Chelsea Szendi Schieder. I am an associate professor at Aoyama Gakuin University, and I am a scholar of modern contemporary Japanese social movements, and particularly gender dynamics. So the first question I'll address is, how can I think about a current dilemma using my training? Well, a word that I've been playing with and kicking around is the phrase feminization of crisis, or perhaps feminization of emergency. This phrase adapts from the phrase feminization of poverty, which refers to the unequal gendered effects of poverty. It's often used in policy circles when discussing the way that extreme economic deprivation and scarcity fall unevenly on a population based on gendered hierarchies already in place. But we can see even in a relatively affluent society like Japan that gendered hierarchies inform how work, and by work I would emphasize both formal employment and uncompensated family care work, these things are allocated and valued according to gendered hierarchies, and that creates particularly vulnerable segments of the population. And in Japan, these can tend to be women, single mothers, elderly unmarried women, immigrant women, also those who don't easily conform to the heteronormative definition of women. So in these times, when societies are facing a crisis, when governments are close to declaring states of emergency or demand that people go into their domestic spaces and refrain from being in public spaces, how does that shake out in terms of gender? When I heard in late February that Japan would close the schools, I thought immediately that this decision was based on an idea that somebody would be able to be at home to care for elementary school children. And in the case where there's no grandparents, and in the case where there are working couples, because of the way that more demanding work, full-time work, better compensated work tends to be allocated to men, I feared that probably women would be, who are working mothers, would be pressured to step back and fill in this care work gap opened up by the closure of the schools. But there's so many other questions. If a quarantine goes into place, what about households with domestic violence? If people no longer are able to hire domestic help, which often tends to be female, what happens to those workers? What about the often female workforce in night work spaces, sex work? These are all these strands that perhaps we can explore if we use this term feminization of crisis or feminization of emergency. So the next question, what are the biggest challenges, both as a researcher and personally? First of all, information is just changing so quickly that it can be hard to just evaluate what decisions to make to protect my health, the health of my family, and that's a kind of personal challenge. Also, my ability to collect information on this is limited by my languages, which languages I can access information in. And that shapes how I'm seeing the crisis as well. But these individual limits, I think, also speak to a wider challenge, which could be that of collaboration, discussing with other researchers our individual limitations. Recognizing our individual limitations could be a way for us to build some kind of solidarity, more collaboration, greater coordination. And so I'm very optimistic about this, especially because this crisis is demonstrating how not just public health is not limited to a single border, to national borders, but also how our production chains are interdependent, and of course how the way that humans interact with their environment is not limited to one space as well. The way a virus thinks is very different from the way that we think about borders and nations. So all of that is an invitation for us to think collaboratively, globally, and so I'm very excited for what could come out of this. The next question I'd like to address is, what does this crisis illuminate about the role of humanities research? Well, I've been listening to a lot of epidemiologists recently, and there is often a point in these discussions about what we can know about this pandemic and this virus from the natural sciences, when we understand that the response to this knowledge has everything to do with the way that we organize human society and we organize human knowledge. And those are the discussions where humanities scholars and humanities researchers can really make a big contribution. So to talk about, again, a specific example, if I loop back around to this idea of the feminization of crisis, how do we see care work, which is often considered women's work, often considered feminine work, often when it's taken out of the public sphere is put into the home where it becomes women's work. How do we see in this crisis care being discussed, care being mobilized, weaponized, ignored, and with what implications according to assumptions about gender and with regard to economic and social security or precarity? These are the kinds of questions that humanities scholars ask and are good at analyzing. Who will bear the greatest burdens in this crisis? How are those categories created by hierarchical structures already existing within society? So I think of this term feminization of crisis as a phrase that can do work if it helps us think about this. This crisis will test our social fabric, and it also seems poised to threaten our civil liberties. So the balance of care, public health, privacy, all of that at this moment is up for discussion, and humanities scholars are particularly well trained to trace and analyze these narratives and their repercussions over time. So I think their voices are very necessary in this moment. One other question I would like to address is, what are my questions for viewers? Well, based on my own experiences as a researcher of Japan who was based in Tokyo at the time of the triple earthquake, tsunami, nuclear disaster of March 11th, 2011, and then as a researcher of social movements who has also witnessed Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Fridays for the Future, Extinction Rebellion. What I've seen in these moments is a hugely distracting reconfiguration of what you think daily life is or your next task, and that can be very frustrating if you are a researcher trying to concentrate, but it's also can be a very productive distraction or disruption by creating new chances to ask new questions, read new materials, create new networks. So my question to you really would be, what are you thinking about that you perhaps hadn't really thought about before? And how might that be something you could link to something you'd thought about and researched very closely and in depth before? Also, it's an invitation, I think, to think about the structures within which we operate, because, of course, any kind of crisis situation also affects how the academy is structured, what kind of funding happens, who gets jobs, who doesn't, and these are really important questions for us to be thinking about as well. So my questions for you would be, what are you thinking? What are you thinking about? What are coming up for you? What are the new questions popping up in your head? So I'm answering my question by sharing my questions and asking you what questions you have. But this is a moment for new questions. So thank you.